No one wanted the ugly horse at the winter auction until the rancher's daughter saw something in him no one else dared to look for. On a freezing Montana morning, a horse everyone ignored stood trembling in the auction ring, unwanted, overlooked, seconds away from disappearing forever. But when a young woman lifted her hand, something ancient stirred in the snow-filled air. She didn't just save a horse that day. She awakened a miracle no one saw coming. The winter auction yard in northern Montana always looked a little tired in December, but that morning it felt especially worn, like an old man trying to stand straight against a wind that never stopped blowing. Frost clung to every rail and hinge, turning the wooden pens into pale skeletons under a sky the color of cold steel. People moved in small clusters, wrapped in canvas coats and wool scarves, their boots crunching over ice as they drifted from pen to pen. Most were here for deals, not miracles. Winter auctions rarely offered either. Lila Mercer tightened the faded wool scarf around her neck, the one her mother had knitted years before the accident. She didn't need its warmth as much as she needed its familiarity. The scarf felt like the last soft thing left in a world that had hardened too fast. Her breath rose in thin white curls as she stepped deeper into the rows of horses, some restless, some resigned, some too thin for the cold. Ethan walked a few paces behind her, hands in his coat pockets, shoulders curved inward against the wind and against life itself. He didn't say it out loud, but Lila knew what he was thinking. We shouldn't be here, not today, not with bills stacked on the kitchen table, like a wall. But the Mercers needed one more horse if their small Montana ranch was going to make it through spring. And so they were here, searching for something they could afford, something sturdy enough to help with chores and gentle enough to work in the small equine therapy program they hoped to rebuild. Lila wasn't thinking about marketing terms or practical things like horse care, mental health programs, or outdoor safety tips that always popped up online when she looked for advice. She was thinking about what her mother once told her. Sometimes the right one isn't the one people notice. Sometimes you have to listen with something other than your eyes. She didn't know why that memory surfaced now. Maybe because everything around her felt gray and disconnected. Maybe because her father barely spoke these days except to give instructions. Maybe because she was tired. Tired of missing her mother, tired of the silence in the house, tired of watching her father break in small, invisible ways. She paused at the last row of pens. A few horses crowded near the rails, ears flicking, hoping for attention or a treat. But in the far corner, partly hidden behind the wooden post, stood a horse that didn't move at all. At first glance, she thought he was simply resting. But then he lifted his head, slowly, like someone rising after a long, painful night. The horse was strange. Not in any dramatic way, not injured, not wild, just wrong in all the places people cared about. His coat was a mottled blend of black and ash gray, like burned timber dusted with fresh snow. One shoulder sat slightly higher than the other, giving him a guarded stance, as if he'd learned to stand where he wouldn't be noticed. His left eye was clouded, though not blind, and his mane hung in uneven strands as if life had been trimming him instead of a groom. He wasn't pretty. He wasn't striking. He wasn't anything auctions valued. Yet when he looked at her, really looked, something in Lila went still. That eye, the clear one, held a quietness she recognized, a tired dignity, a softness that somehow survived being ignored by the world. "Don't stare too long," Ethan murmured behind her. "That one's probably going cheap, but cheap usually comes with a reason." Lila didn't answer. She stepped closer to the pen, lifting her hand slowly so she wouldn't spook him. But the horse didn't flinch or lean back. He simply watched her, breath rising in small warm clouds, ears turning with an attentiveness that felt almost human. A loudspeaker crackled behind them, calling buyers to the ring. The horse barely reacted. No prancing, no nervous shifting, just a long, slow blink, as if asking nothing, expecting nothing. Lila felt something tighten in her chest. Not emotion exactly, more like recognition. An echo. The announcer's voice carried across the yard. "Lot 52, bring him in." Ethan exhaled sharply. "Come on, Lila, we can't waste time on every stray that looks at you like that." But Lila couldn't move. She watched the handlers clip a rope to the horse's halter, leading him toward the sale ring. Even the way he walked was quiet. Measured steps, steady, almost apologetic, as if he was trying not to be in anyone's way. She followed a few steps behind without realizing it, her boots sliding slightly on the frost. Ethan sighed and walked after her. Inside the ring, the other buyers gathered loosely near the rails. Most were ranchers. A few were traders. And then there were the men she disliked most, the buyers who came for horses no one wanted, loading them onto trucks, headed nowhere hopeful. They stood with their hands deep in their coat pockets, eyes calculating, ready to grab whatever slipped through the cracks. The horse stood in the center, still as a stone. Snowflakes drifted onto his mane, melting slowly. 8-year-old gelding, the auctioneer announced. Mixed breeding, sound, broke to ride, no papers. Let's start at $50. Silence. Not the thoughtful silence of people considering a deal. The kind that fills a room when everyone agrees on something without speaking. A judgment passed before the gavel even lifts. Lila felt her heartbeat. Pick up, small but insistent. "Come on, folks," the auctioneer tried again. $50 to start. A man in a thick brown coat finally lifted his hand. Not a rancher, not a trainer. One of them. A kill buyer. The kind who didn't mind what a horse looked like, only how much they weighed. "30, here," the man called, already assured no one would counter. Lila swallowed hard. The horse didn't look at the man or the auctioneer. Only at her, straight through her. Quiet. Waiting. Something inside her moved before she could stop it. And then she raised her hand. 20, her voice cracked, too loud in the cold air. The auctioneer jolted in surprise. Ethan turned as if slapped. The horse lifted his head, ears pricking forward, not dramatically, just barely. A tiny, fragile acknowledgement. A lifeline made of breath and winter light. Lila felt it. Felt everything tilt. The chapter ends here, exactly where her life begins to change, because of a choice small enough to be dismissed and brave enough to be remembered. For a heartbeat, no one seemed to breathe. Lila's voice still echoed faintly in the rafters of the auction ring, as if the cold air hadn't decided yet whether to hold it or let it fall. Snow drifted through the open slats overhead, settling on the gelding's back like dust on an old photograph. The kill buyer lowered his hand, surprised enough that the expression cracked through the mask of indifference he usually wore. 20 from the young lady, the auctioneer said, blinking as though trying to place her in a room full of strangers. His voice regained its rhythm. Do I hear 25? The kill buyer lifted his hand again, slow and deliberate, like a man reaching for something inevitable. 25. Lila felt her stomach twist, but she didn't look at him. She looked at the horse, at the faint quiver of breath from his nostrils, the tired patience in his stance. No fear, no resistance, no expectation. Just the same quiet watching that had pulled her in from the first moment. She didn't know why she felt so fiercely protective of him, this odd, uneven horse with a clouded eye and a coat that looked like smoke and ash. But she did, deeply, suddenly, completely. She lifted her hand again. 30. Ethan hissed her name, not loud enough for the crowd to hear, but sharp enough to cut the thin air between them. "Lila, stop! You don't know what you're doing." She didn't look back. Couldn't. Something in her had already moved beyond hesitation, beyond fear, as if a small, stubborn truth inside her had finally pushed its way through the cracks. The kill-buyer hesitated. One of his companions muttered something she couldn't hear, and then he lifted his hand again, but without much conviction. 40. It was a number thrown out of annoyance, not desire. He wanted the transaction to end so he could load the other unwanted stock and leave before the snow thickened. Lila felt that hesitation like a door half open. She inhaled, the cold slicing her lungs. 50, she said, voice steadier now. A few heads turned. Some people smiled faintly, the kind of smile adults give a teenager doing something foolish but earnest. Ethan closed his eyes briefly, the way he did when a memory hurt too much. The kill-buyer didn't bid again. The auctioneer's gavel hovered in the air. 50 going once, going twice. The horse shifted his weight, one soft clop against the frozen ground. Nothing remarkable, yet Lila felt the sound move through her chest like a slow, steady pulse. Sold. The gavel struck the wooden block with a dull, echoing crack. Lila's breath left her in a quiet rush. Not triumph, not fear, something softer. Relief, maybe, though she couldn't explain why the fate of a horse she'd known for less than an hour mattered enough to make her hands tremble. The kill-buyer shrugged and turned away, already uninterested. The small crowd dispersed, boots crunching on ice, voices drifting like smoke into the winter morning. Ethan didn't move at first. When he finally did, it was with a slow, heavy exhale. "What did you just do, Lila?" She turned toward him, scarf fluttering in the wind, cheeks touched red by the cold. She wanted to explain, wanted to say she didn't know, and yet she knew exactly. Wanted to describe the feeling in her chest that wouldn't let her walk away. Not from this horse, not today. But all that came out was the simplest truth she could manage. "I bought him," she said, "for us." Ethan stared at her a long moment, jaw tight. "We needed a horse with sound conformation, one that could pull weight, work the line, maybe help with the therapy program. We needed something presentable, reliable, not—" He stopped himself, shaking his head. "Not this." Lila looked back toward the gelding. The handlers were already leading him toward the holding area, rope slack between his halter and the gloved hands guiding him. The snow swirled around his legs, collecting on his uneven mane. He walked without struggle, without protest, with the strange, measured calm of someone who had learned long ago that life rarely asked what he wanted. "I think he's exactly what we need," she said softly. Ethan didn't argue further, not because he agreed, but because he was too tired to fight something that was already done. "Come on," he said at last, voice low. "Let's go settle the paperwork." They walked together toward the small auction office. Ethan with the weariness of a man stretched too thin, Lila with an anxious resolve knotting itself inside her chest. The office smelled of thawing mud and old coffee, the kind of warm, stale air that hit hard after the bite of winter. The clerk barely glanced up as Ethan handed over the worn checkbook. "Lot 52, he muttered, printing out a receipt. "Mixed gelding. Congratulations." Ethan didn't respond. Lila almost laughed, though not out of humor. She never imagined that being congratulated could feel so heavy. When they returned to the holding pens, the horse stood alone near the gate, breath fogging in the cold. The handler stepped aside. "He's calm," he said. "Loaded easy when he came in. Should load easy for you." Lila stepped forward slowly, her boots sliding slightly on the thin layer of frost. The horse lifted his head, not high, not dramatically, just enough to acknowledge her presence. When she reached out her hand, he leaned forward, letting the side of his face brush her fingers. The skin there felt warmer than she expected, warmer than the air, warmer than anything had felt since before her mother died. "Hi," she whispered, unsure why she felt the need to speak softly. "I'm Lila." The horse exhaled, a long, gentle breath that curled around her hand like steam. Then he lowered his head, almost to her chest height, and stood as still as falling snow. Ethan watched from a few steps away, arms folded across his coat. Something flickered across his expression, a quiet recognition maybe, or the memory of what it felt like to trust something without needing a reason. "What are you going to call him?" he asked. Lila didn't answer immediately. She studied the horse, the ash-dark coat, the one clouded eye, the quiet strength in the way he held himself despite everything life had done to him. "Nighthawk," she said, "because he looks like the last shadow before morning." Ethan's eyebrows lifted. "That's poetic." "It's who he is," she said simply. The wind swept across the yard, carrying with it the cold promise of heavier snow. Ethan finally nodded toward the trailer. "Let's get him home before the storm builds. This weather's only good for selling winter travel insurance." Lila smiled faintly at the attempt at humor. Together they walked the gelding to the trailer. True to the handler's word, Nighthawk stepped inside without hesitation, without fear, settling into the straw as if he'd been waiting for this exact place, this exact moment. As Ethan latched the door, Lila rested her hand on the cold metal, eyes lingering on the shape of the horse inside. She didn't know what the days ahead would hold. She didn't know if they'd made a terrible mistake. But she knew this. Something had shifted the moment she lifted her hand in the auction ring. Something small, something quiet, something that felt inexplicably right. The truck engine rumbled, and they pulled away from the auction yard just as the first thick flakes began to fall, blurring the world into a soft gray canvas, one where new stories could be drawn without anyone noticing. The storm arrived by nightfall, brushing against the Mercer ranch with long fingers of wind that rattled the loose tin panels on the barn roof. By morning, Montana had quieted into that peculiar stillness that only follows heavy snow when the world feels reset, stripped clean, and strangely fragile. Lila stepped onto the porch, pulling her coat tight as she surveyed the landscape. White stretched in every direction, softening the sharp ridgelines and swallowing the worn fences until they looked like strokes of charcoal under a pale sky. Ethan had already trudged toward the barn, his boot prints forming a dark, uneven trail across the yard. Lila followed, breath clouding in steady bursts. The barn doors groaned when she pushed them open, releasing the warm, hay-scented air inside. Steam curled gently from the backs of the horses they still kept, Maisie, the old buckskin mare, and Flint, the aging sorrel gelding who had carried her through childhood. Their familiar shapes greeted her like family, but her eyes went straight to the newly bedded stall at the far end. Nighthawk stood there quietly, as if he'd been waiting for her. He lifted his head when she approached, snowflakes still melting in his mane. His clouded eye reflected just enough light to make it shine like frosted glass, while the clear one locked onto her with an attentiveness that felt almost deliberate. He didn't whinny, didn't toss his head, didn't stamp his hooves as most new horses did in a strange place. Instead, he simply breathed, a long, steady exhale that warmed the cold space between them. "You settled in okay," Lila murmured, offering a handful of hay. He didn't snatch it the way nervous horses sometimes did. He took it gently, brushing her palm with the soft velvet of his lips, and then lowered his head to chew, each movement unhurried. Ethan leaned against the stall door, arms folded, observing with the quiet skepticism he'd carried since the auction. "He's calm," he admitted. "Too calm, maybe." "He's just trying to understand where he is," Lila said. "Or he's hiding something." Ethan scratched his jaw. Horses with pasts don't usually come this quiet. Lila knew he wasn't wrong. Horses that passed through too many hands often carried tension in their bodies like scars. But Nighthawk didn't seem tense. He seemed cautious. Not fearful, not dull, just careful in the way he moved, like someone navigating a house full of sleeping people. She stepped into the stall, moving slowly. Nighthawk shifted just enough to face her, as though he refused to let her out of his field of vision. When she raised her hand to touch his neck, he didn't shy away. He leaned into the contact with the weight of someone starved for gentleness. Ethan watched, brow furrowed. "That's not normal for a horse with an eye like that," he said quietly. "Most would be jumpy on their blind side." "He's not blind," Lila replied. "Just clouded. Clouded means he can't see well, and not seeing well means being jumpy." Ethan paused, unless someone taught him otherwise. The words hung in the air like a clue neither of them yet understood. When they led Nighthawk outside, he followed with an unusual grace, stepping exactly where Lila stepped, as if attuning himself to her rhythm. The snow was deep enough to muffle every sound, so each hoofprint echoed in the stillness like a soft drum against the earth. Maisie snorted from her paddock, tossing her head at the new arrival. Flint flicked his ears, cautious but curious. Horses didn't often accept newcomers quickly. They measured strangers in body language and quiet tests. Nighthawk didn't try to approach them. He merely stood near the fence, head lowered, letting them smell the air around him, offering his presence without insisting on anything. After a few minutes, Maisie relaxed her stance, and Flint stepped a little closer. Ethan blinked. Well, look at that. He knows how to introduce himself. Lila didn't say anything, but she saw it too. Saw how Nighthawk waited, how he understood the unspoken rituals of herd behavior. Not dominating, not submitting, just reading the moment like someone who'd watched many others do the same. She led him to the round pen to watch him move. As he circled, his gait revealed exactly what she feared. The unevenness in his shoulder wasn't just cosmetic. The right hind leg favored the left slightly, a subtle drag that only showed after a few laps. Not a limp, more like a memory of injury. A ghost in his stride. Ethan saw it too. "That'll limit him," he said lightly, though the disappointment in his voice was unmistakable. "Trail work maybe, but anything heavier." "I know," Lila said. "Therapy work?" he asked. She watched Nighthawk slow to a halt, turning to face her of his own accord. The way he looked at her was unsettling in its clarity, as if he understood the conversation, as if he'd had conversations like it before. "Therapy work," she murmured. "Maybe that's exactly what he's meant for." Ethan sighed. "Let's hope so." Then he walked toward the gate, muttering something about checking the generator before noon. The barn lot grew quiet again. Lila stood in the center of the pen, snow drifting into her hair as she studied the horse before her. The morning light made his coat shimmer like smudged charcoal, highlighting every imperfection. Yet she had never seen anything so quietly striking. She stepped forward. Nighthawk mirrored her. Another step. He mirrored again. It was a small thing, a simple thing, but something about it tugged at a place inside her that had been numb for a long time. "You're not what people think you are," she whispered. "Are you?" Nighthawk lowered his head, resting his nose lightly against her coat. The touch was deliberate, slow, filled with a kind of hesitant trust. And for the first time since her mother died, Lila felt that numb place inside her warm, just a little, just enough. Later that afternoon, while sweeping the aisle of the barn, she heard footsteps and turned to see Dr. May Bishop approaching. The older woman's cheeks were wind-burned, her silver hair tucked under a faded beanie. "Ethan said you picked up a new horse," May greeted softly. "Thought I'd come see." Lila hesitated. "He's different." "Different can be good," May replied. When May reached Nighthawk's stall, she stopped, eyes narrowing, not in disapproval, but in recognition. Something unreadable flickered in her expression. "Well," May whispered, barely audible. "I'll be damned," Lila frowned. "What? You've seen him before?" May didn't answer immediately. Instead, she stepped closer to the bars, studying Nighthawk with a tenderness that surprised Lila. The gelding blinked slowly, lifting his head as if greeting an old memory. May exhaled, breath tremoring just slightly. "Lila," she said, voice lower than before, "there's something you need to know about this horse." And just like that, the world felt as if it had shifted again, quietly, the way snow shifts under a single footprint. A new thread pulled loose. A new door opened. But May didn't finish her sentence. Not yet. Not here. Nighthawk watched them both, one clear eye shining with calm intelligence, as if he understood the weight of whatever May had left hanging in the cold, quiet barn. Dr. May didn't explain herself that afternoon. Something in her eyes said the story was bigger than a few quick sentences tossed into the cold air of a barn aisle. Instead, she promised to return the next day, leaving Lila with a lingering tension that hummed beneath her ribs like the low thrum of distant thunder, the sort that warns you something important is coming. The following morning, the snow had stopped, but the sky remained a soft, muted gray, the kind of light that makes everything feel quieter, as if even the sun was treading softly. Lila carried a bucket of warm mash toward Nighthawk's stall, humming under her breath without noticing. The horse lifted his head as soon as she stepped inside, that familiar, measured awareness in every line of his body. "You're starting to feel like home," she murmured. Before she could place the bucket down, she heard a faint scuff of boots behind her. Too light to be her father's, too hesitant to belong to anyone comfortable. She turned and saw a small figure standing just inside the barn doors. A boy. Maybe 10. Maybe younger. Wrapped in a puffy blue jacket zipped all the way to his chin. His knit hat sat crooked, one glove missing, and snow clung to the cuffs of his jeans as if he had walked a long way without stopping. His eyes, dark, wide, and unblinking, were fixed not on Lila, but on Nighthawk. "Hi," Lila said softly, keeping her voice low, careful. "Are you looking for my dad? He's out by the woodpile." The boy didn't answer. He didn't even twitch. Kids sometimes froze like that around horses, especially ones unsure how to approach. But Lila sensed this was something different, not fear, but a kind of inwardness, as if the world around him was muted and distant. She took one slow step toward him. "Do you want to come closer?" Still no response, but Nighthawk moved, not abruptly, not dramatically, just 2 quiet steps toward the stall door, lowering his head until his nose nearly touched the metal latch. His ears pricked forward, not stiff, not alert, but gently curious, the way a horse greets a newborn foal or a creature more fragile than itself. The boy blinked, only once, but it was enough to see something shift in his gaze, like a shutter opening just a fraction to let in the smallest ray of light. Lila knelt down to the boy's level, giving him space, letting the silence breathe. The barn was still enough that she could hear the soft creak of the rafters, the distant drip of melted snow falling from the roof. She didn't need to force the moment. She sensed that it would unfold the way snowfall settles, slow, natural, inevitable. "What's your name?" she asked. The boy pressed his lips together, his throat moving in a swallow that looked like effort. The missing glove caught her eye. His exposed fingers, reddened from the cold, curled tightly against the fabric of his jacket. Maybe he had run here. Maybe he had wandered. Maybe he came because something told him he needed to be near something gentle. Nighthawk stretched his neck further, breathing a slow, warm breath that drifted across the boy's cheek. The boy's eyes widened, and his fingers unclenched slightly. Not much, but enough for Lila to notice. "His name is Nighthawk," she whispered. "He doesn't talk either, not with words, just with presence." The boy's gaze flicked from the horse to her, and for the first time she saw recognition, or perhaps relief, as if someone had finally spoken in a language he understood. A voice echoed faintly from outside. "Jonah!" Lila turned toward the door in time to see a woman rushing across the yard, her face flushed with worry. When she spotted the boy, she exhaled shakily and hurried inside. "Oh, thank God," she breathed. "I've been looking everywhere for you." She rested a hand on his shoulder, though gently, afraid to startle him. "I'm so sorry. I hope he didn't bother." "Not at all," Lila said. "He's fine." The woman nodded, relief softening her features. He's not always this calm. I'm Rachel. We live at the Caldwell place down the road. Jonah sometimes wanders when he gets overwhelmed." Jonah. The name fit him in a way she couldn't explain. Quiet, old soul, like a boy who carried tides inside him. "He likes Nighthawk," Lila said softly. Rachel blinked as if unsure she heard correctly. "He does? He usually avoids animals. Loud noises, eye contact." She hesitated, then added with a tremor in her voice, "He hasn't spoken in months." Lila didn't respond right away. She looked at Jonah, who was now standing close enough that his gloveless fingers brushed the metal of the stall. Nighthawk didn't move except to lower his head further, closer, as if anchoring the boy in the quiet way only certain beings can. Jonah's shoulders sank, his posture softening, and then a sound, small, fragile, more breath than voice. "Hawk!" Rachel gasped, covering her mouth. Lila felt her throat tighten. Jonah remained still, as if the word had escaped him by accident, drawn out by something gentle enough to coax him from the safety of silence. Nighthawk exhaled softly, the warm gust stirring Jonah's hair. Rachel's eyes glistened. I don't know how to thank—" "You don't need to," Lila said, her voice barely more than a whisper. "He came here because he felt safe. That's enough." Jonah stayed a moment longer before letting Rachel guide him out the door. When they stepped into the fading winter light, Jonah turned, once, only once, to look back at Nighthawk. Lila stayed beside the gelding long after they left. The barn felt different somehow, fuller, lighter, carrying a warmth that had nothing to do with the heated lamps above. "You knew," she murmured, placing her hand against his cheek. "Didn't you?" Nighthawk's clear eye blinked slowly. His breath warmed her palm, and something inside her stirred, a fragile echo of what she'd felt at the auction, the sense that this horse was more than a purchase, more than a rescue. He was a presence, a quiet force, a guide, and now a boy in a blue jacket had felt it too. Outside, the winter sky shifted, a single ray of pale sunlight breaking through the clouds as if the day had bowed its head in acknowledgement. The morning after Jonah spoke his first word in months, the Mercer Ranch felt strangely alive. Not louder, just more awake, as though something had nudged the world a degree closer to warmth. Frost still covered the fences, shimmering under the pale Montana sun. But Lila moved through the yard with a new lightness she hadn't felt in years. It lingered in her chest like a slow ember that refused to dim. Dr. May Bishop arrived just after breakfast, her truck crunching over the icy gravel. She stepped out with the careful movements of a woman who knew winter too well, guarding her joints from the cold, keeping her breath slow and even. The wind tugged at her scarf as she approached the barn, clutching a worn leather satchel against her chest. "You said you had something to tell me," Lila said, meeting her near the entrance. May nodded, her expression unreadable. "Let's do this inside. Warmer in the stalls." Inside, the air carried the earthy smell of hay and cedar shavings, softened by the heat lamps above. Nighthawk stood in his stall, chewing quietly, the rhythm of his jaw steady as a metronome. When he saw May, he lifted his head, not startled but attentive, as though recognizing someone important. May's breath left her in a faint tremor. "He remembers," she murmured. "I wasn't sure if he would." Lila frowned. "Why would he remember you?" Instead of answering, May placed her satchel on a bale of hay and unbuckled the straps. She pulled out a faded file folder, its edges softened by years, corners curled, label smudged. She held it carefully, almost reverently, before offering it to Lila. "I kept this," May said, "because I had a feeling he'd come back into someone's life in a way that mattered. I just didn't know it would be yours." Lila opened the folder slowly. A small stack of photographs slid into her hand, old, worn, each one carrying a weight she didn't understand yet. The first photo made her inhale sharply. Nighthawk, years younger, healthier, his coat darker, his stance proud. He stood beside a group of wildfire rescue workers wearing orange uniforms, each person holding a hand to his neck as though grounding themselves through him. Their faces were exhausted, soot-smeared, but softened by a kind of quiet appreciation that only came from surviving something together. Lila flipped to the next image. Nighthawk carried a woman with bandaged hands, guiding her gently along a forest edge scorched black. The horse's posture was careful, almost protective. Another photo. A man in a smoke-stained jacket leaned his forehead against Nighthawk's, eyes closed as though the horse was the only steady thing left in a collapsing world. Lila's fingers trembled. What was he?" May exhaled. "A partner," she said simply. "A therapy companion for first responders. Part of an experimental program designed for wildfire crews. He was trained to sense distress, physical, emotional, all of it. And he didn't just learn. He excelled." Lila shook her head, stunned. "But how did he end up at the auction?" May hesitated, a hesitation heavy enough to pull the barn into stillness. "After a major fire 8 years ago," she said quietly, "the program lost funding. The team disbanded. Some animals were reassigned, some were adopted out, and some slipped through cracks they shouldn't have. Nighthawk ended up passed from one handler to another, eventually landing with someone who didn't know what he'd been trained for. He became that strange horse, too sensitive, too intuitive, too much." The thought tightened something inside Lila's chest. She looked at Nighthawk, at the slope of his shoulders, the quiet strength in his stance, the patience that felt carved from something ancient. She had sensed from the beginning that he was different, but she hadn't realized just how deep that difference ran. "Why didn't anyone keep him?" she whispered. "A horse like this? How could he be forgotten?" May met her gaze, eyes dim with the weight of years. "Sometimes the world forgets the ones who carry its heaviest burdens," she said, "especially when their wounds don't show." The words landed softly, but they hit something inside Lila that already knew. She wasn't just learning Nighthawk's history. She was learning how grief moves through the body, quiet and unspoken, the same way her father carried his trauma, the same way she carried her mother's absence. May continued. "He shuts down when he doesn't understand the people around him. He waits, observes, tries to help in ways most folks don't notice. But if no one listens, he disappears into himself." Lila nodded slowly. It made sense. His calm wasn't dullness. His silence wasn't indifference. It was the stillness of someone trained to anchor others, a horse who learned to hold space for broken hearts until they could hold themselves again. "He's already helping," Lila said, voice tightening. "Yesterday," Jonah spoke. Just one word, but he spoke. May's eyebrows lifted. "He hasn't spoken for months," Rachel said. "I know." Then Nighthawk did what he was trained to do. They turned to look at the gelding. He watched them both, ears tilted forward, breathing slow and even. Lila moved closer, placing her hand on the warm plane of his neck. The horse nudged her shoulder lightly, soft, careful, grounding. "Does my father know?" she asked. May shook her head. "Not yet." "And Ethan?" She hesitated. "He may have feelings about it. Horses like Nighthawk bring things to the surface, especially for people who've seen too much." Lila looked toward the distant window where her father was hauling firewood, his movements efficient, silent, carrying that old heaviness she wished she could pry loose. She stroked Nighthawk's face gently. "Maybe that's what he needs. Someone who sees him." May closed the folder and handed it back. "This horse is not just a rescue, Lila. He's a mirror, and mirrors can heal or break. Depends on who's willing to look." A soft rumble echoed across the yard, the low thunder of snow shifting on the barn roof. The sound made Nighthawk flick an ear but stay calm. "And now?" Lila asked. "Now," May said, pulling on her gloves, "you learn to listen to him." Nighthawk lowered his head, pressing his forehead lightly into Lila's shoulder. The gesture was so gentle it felt like a benediction. Outside, the wind shifted, carrying with it a faint warmth from the south. It wasn't much, barely a whisper of the coming thaw, but enough for Lila to sense that Nighthawk's arrival had stirred something bigger than she understood. Not a storm, a change, a beginning carved from the ashes of a past neither she nor her father had yet faced. The fog rolled in before dawn, thick enough to blur the fence posts and swallow the distant cottonwoods in a soft gray hush. It was the kind of Montana morning that felt suspended. No wind, no birdsong, only the slow breath of winter resting on the land. Lila stepped outside with her coat half-zipped, drawn by an instinct she couldn't name. Something in the air felt different today, as if the world had paused just long enough to let something wounded find its way home. When she reached the barn, Nighthawk was already awake. He stood near the door of his stall, ears pricked, breathing evenly. There was a calm alertness in him she had learned to recognize. He sensed something approaching before she ever did. "Who's out there?" Lila murmured, stroking the white frosted strands of his mane. The gelding flicked an ear toward the open barn doors. Lila followed his gaze and saw a figure stepping through the fog, moving slowly across the yard. At first she thought it might be May, but May's gait was steadier, her steps more deliberate. This woman walked with the careful rhythm of someone carrying grief in her bones. When she drew closer, Lila recognized her. Rachel's sister-in-law, Amy Caldwell, the widow who lived alone in the small cabin near the edge of the valley. Amy was rarely seen outside except for groceries or feed. Her husband had died in a logging accident 3 years before, and since then she had moved through life like a shadow that hadn't decided whether it wanted to remain in the world. But here she was, standing barefoot inside her boots, cheeks flushed from the cold, eyes red as though she'd been awake all night. "Morning," Lila said softly. Amy nodded, her voice rough. "I was hoping I could see him. The new horse." Lila didn't ask how she'd heard. News in a small valley traveled the way light reflected on snow, quiet, inevitable, without effort. She simply stepped aside and let Amy enter. Nighthawk watched her closely, not with suspicion, with recognition. Amy approached slowly, her breath visible in the cold air. Her gloved hand shook when she reached for the stall door. She didn't open it. She just held the wooden frame as though it were the only solid thing in her world. "I don't sleep well," she whispered. "Not for a long time. Nights are loud, even when they're silent." Lila said nothing. Some stories weren't meant to be interrupted. Amy's voice trembled. "I heard what happened with Jonah. Rachel came by yesterday, crying in the driveway. I thought—" she swallowed. "I thought maybe I could just stand near him. I won't be long." Lila stepped back, giving her space. Nighthawk lowered his head, breathing warm fog into the cold space between them. He didn't move closer. He didn't demand anything from her. He simply waited. Amy let out a breath that sounded like surrender. Carefully, she reached under the latch and touched the side of his muzzle. Her glove brushed his skin in a shaky line, and Lila saw her shoulders drop, just an inch, but enough to change the shape of her entire posture, as if a weight she'd carried alone had shifted, if only slightly. "You're gentle," Amy whispered. "My husband. He used to say some horses carry light in them, even when the world tries to put it out." Her words hovered in the air like frost crystals, fragile and glowing. Nighthawk exhaled, softly, pressing the top of his head against her palm. Not pushing, just leaning, grounding her with the warmth of a creature who understood loss without needing to hear the details. Amy covered her mouth with her other hand as tears pooled in her eyes. "I'm sorry," she said, even though she wasn't bothering anyone. "You don't have to be," Lila murmured. For a long moment, the barn seemed to pulse with nothing but quiet breathing. Amy's trembling, Lila's steady, and Nighthawk's deep. Anchoring rhythm. It felt like the whole world had shrunk to those 3 breaths, woven together in a place that had seen more sorrow than it deserved. Then Nighthawk took a half-step closer. Barely a shift of weight, but unmistakable. Amy let out a startled sob, followed by a soft laugh that broke apart in the cold air. "He knows," she whispered. "He really does." Lila felt her throat tighten. She had seen Nighthawk's intuition before, but with Jonah it had been a spark, unexpected and miraculous. With Amy it was something different, something deeper, a resonance between 2 beings who had lived too long with the kind of silence no one else understood. Amy wiped her cheeks with the back of her glove. "Thank you," she whispered to the horse, then to Lila. "I needed something. I didn't know what, but it's him." Lila nodded. "Come back any time. He doesn't mind visitors." Amy hesitated, then smiled, small, wavering, but real. "Maybe I will." She turned to leave, disappearing back into the fog the same way she had come, her steps slower now, as if each one hurt a little less. Lila leaned against the stall door once she was gone. "You help people find pieces of themselves, don't you?" she whispered to Nighthawk. The horse blinked, lowered his head, and nudged her shoulder with a gentleness that felt like memory and understanding woven together. Ethan's voice echoed faintly from outside. "Lila? Generator's acting up again. Need a hand." She gave Nighthawk one last soft stroke. "Duty calls." As she walked out into the thinning fog, she glanced back once, only once, to see Nighthawk standing in the stall doorway, his silhouette framed by the gray morning light. He looked like a sentinel carved from shadow and quiet strength, a creature who carried histories no one could see and burdens no one had asked him to bear. But he bore them anyway. And for the first time since the auction, Lila understood. He wasn't here by accident. People were finding their way to him, each carrying a different ache. Maybe the valley had been waiting for him. Maybe she had. Outside, the fog began to lift. The fog finally lifted by afternoon, revealing the long sweep of the valley. White fields, dark pines, and the distant ridge where the forest thickened like a wall of old secrets. Ethan usually kept to the ranch on days like this, tending to small chores, checking fences, repairing tools in need of attention. But something in his posture had been unsettled since morning, a quiet restlessness that pulled him toward the tree line long before he admitted it. "I'll go check the upper trail," he said, tightening the straps of his winter pack. "The thaw yesterday might have loosened that ridge again." Lila looked up from brushing Nighthawk. "I can go with you." "No," Ethan said too quickly. "You stay here. Someone needs to keep an eye on things. I won't be long." He wasn't harsh, just guarded. A man drawing invisible boundaries because the world had taught him to survive by holding certain things inside. Lila had learned not to push him when he closed that door, not since the night he woke from a nightmare calling out for teammates who would never answer. She watched him walk away, boots crunching through the thin crust of ice, his shoulders hunched against a cold that seeped deeper than weather. Nighthawk raised his head the moment Ethan disappeared into the trees. His ears stood alert, his posture shifting with that uncanny awareness that still startled her. She stroked his neck soothingly. "He'll be fine," she whispered. "He just needs space today." But Nighthawk didn't soften. He kept staring at the woods long after Ethan was gone. The day passed slowly. Jonah and Rachel didn't come by, though Lila found herself hoping they would, hoping for another soft miracle, another fragile thread connecting one person to something that felt like safety. But the valley was quiet. Too quiet, maybe. Even the wind seemed hesitant. By late afternoon, clouds gathered above the ridge, dragging long shadows across the snow. Lila stepped outside, rubbing her hands together against the cold settling in. Ethan should have been back hours ago. He'd never been careless about winter daylight. It vanished too quickly, turned treacherous too easily. She checked her phone. No messages. The sky darkened slightly, pressing a faint unease into her spine. When she went to the barn to bring the horses in early, Nighthawk was no longer at the back of his stall. He stood pressed against the door, head high, muscles taut beneath his mottled coat. "What is it?" she whispered, unlocking the latch. He stepped out before she finished swinging it open. Not bolting, not spooking, just moving with purpose, like a creature answering a call only he could hear. "Nighthawk, slow down." He didn't. He paced toward the yard, nostrils flaring, head lifting to scent the cold air. The other horses stirred at his urgency, shifting anxiously in their stalls. Lila's pulse quickened. "What's going on?" A moment later she understood. From deep within the forest, so faint she thought she imagined it, came a muffled echo. A sound swallowed by trees, weakened by distance, but unmistakable, a cry struggling to break free of the winter air. "Dad?" Her voice barely carried, but Nighthawk heard it, heard something beneath it. With a sudden surge of motion, he moved toward the pasture gate, pushing the chain with his muzzle, pawing the snow with sharp insistence. "You want me to follow you?" Lila whispered. The gelding turned, eye bright, breath heavy. A low, urgent snort. She didn't hesitate after that. She grabbed a halter, threw it over his head, and looped a rope loosely. She had the feeling he didn't need direction, only company. The forest greeted them with a cold so sharp it felt like needles against her skins. Snow-covered branches bent low over the trail, and the light thinned into a bluish haze beneath the canopy. Nighthawk moved with certainty, weaving through drifts, stepping over fallen limbs, choosing paths she wouldn't have noticed on her own. "Easy," she murmured, though he didn't seem frantic, just driven. The deeper they went, the more the silence tightened. Then, a sound. Clearer this time. Something between a groan and a breath pulled through clenched teeth. Lila's heart lurched. "Dad!" Nighthawk quickened his steps, ears swiveling toward the source. They rounded a narrow bend, and there, half buried beneath a fallen log, was Ethan. Snow had collapsed part of the ridge, sending debris sliding down the slope. A heavy branch had pinned Ethan's leg awkwardly against the ground, and he clutched his thigh, breath shallow. "Lila," he rasped, relief flickering through pain. "How did you—" "Nighthawk," she said breathlessly, already dropping to her knees beside him. "He led me." The gelding stood close, lowering his head until his muzzle brushed Ethan's shoulder. His breath warmed the freezing air around the injured man. Ethan looked at the horse with a bewildered expression, half gratitude, half disbelief. "I'll call for help," Lila said, fumbling for her phone. "No service," Ethan warned. "Not here." Her stomach tightened. The ridge blocked the signal completely. Panic rose like a tide, but Nighthawk shifted, stepping between her and the fallen tree. He nudged the branch with his forehead, testing its weight, its balance. "You can't move that," Ethan muttered. But Nighthawk stepped back, braced his legs, lowered his neck, and pushed again, harder this time, not with recklessness, with technique, a controlled, deliberate force. "Wait, don't let him," Ethan began, but the branch shifted, just an inch, then another, enough for Lila to wedge her shoulder beneath it and lift with every ounce of strength her small frame had. Ethan pulled his leg free with a choked breath. When the branch fell back, it landed harmlessly in the snow. Nighthawk stepped closer, pressing his nose against Ethan's chest, anchoring him with that ancient, steady presence. Lila wrapped her arm under her father's and helped him rise. He winced, but stayed upright. "That horse," Ethan whispered, staring at Nighthawk with a look Lila had never seen on him, not even in his tenderest moments. Something raw, something humbled. "Dad," she said softly, "let him help you." Ethan leaned a hand against Nighthawk's neck. The gelding didn't shift under the weight. Instead, he stood perfectly still, breath steady, as if offering himself as a pillar between a fragile man and the cold world pressing in around them. Step by slow step, they made their way back through the woods. Nighthawk walked beside Ethan the whole time, matching his uneven pace, nudging him gently whenever he faltered, not guiding him, supporting him. By the time the ranch came into view again, dusk had painted the snow a muted lavender. The sight of the barns glowing with warm yellow light brought Lila's breath back into her body, and she exhaled shakily. "You were right," Ethan said softly, voice rough. "He's not just a horse." Lila glanced at Nighthawk, who stood quietly beside them, breath curling like smoke in the fading light. "No," she whispered, "he's something else entirely." By the time they reached the ranch, dusk had thickened into a heavy blue darkness. The first stars were faint behind a curtain of clouds, and the air carried that still, charged quiet that always warned of snow. Lila helped Ethan to the porch, her arm braced around his waist. He tried to brush her off with gruff gratitude, but pain flickered each time his boot touched the ground. "Sit," she ordered softly. "Please." He did, reluctant but obedient. The barchlight cast a soft halo over him, making the lines of exhaustion on his face look deeper. For a moment, he looked older than she'd ever seen him, older even than on the nights when nightmares dragged him awake. Nighthawk stood a few feet away, silhouetted against the yard. He didn't wander, didn't graze, just waited, as if his job wasn't done until Ethan was steady again. "I'll get the first aid kit," Lila said, slipping inside. When she returned, Ethan's head was leaned back against the pillar, eyes closed. But he wasn't asleep. His hand rested on his thigh, fingers trembling slightly, weakness he never let anyone see. Lila knelt to inspect the bruising swelling beneath the torn fabric of his jeans. "It's not broken," she said, "but it's going to hurt." "Already does." He managed a thin smile. "I'll be fine." "You would have frozen out there." He didn't answer. Not right away. His gaze drifted to Nighthawk standing at the edge of the porch light, breath rising in white curls. "That horse found me," Ethan said softly. "Out of all the places I could have been stuck, he went straight to me." Lila followed his gaze. "May told me he used to work with rescue crews. Maybe he recognized the signs. Or maybe," Ethan murmured, "he saw something in me I didn't want to admit." His voice cracked on the last word. "Just a little. Just enough." Lila touched his arm. "Dad?" But before either of them could say more, the wind changed. A heavy, sudden gust swept across, the valley rattling the dry branches, scattering loose straw near the barn. A second gust followed, colder, louder, pulling a groan from the house's old siding. The temperature dropped fast, too fast. Lila looked up. Darkness pressed in from the mountains, swallowing the last hints of twilight. Snowflakes appeared like tiny sparks before building into thick, urgent bands. "Storm's coming in early," Ethan said, forcing himself upright, "and fast." Within minutes, the storm was no longer approaching. It was on them. Snow whipped across the yard in frantic spirals, blurring the barn into a white ghost. The wind roared with the kind of ferocity that made even the strongest structures feel temporary. "Get the horses inside," Ethan said. "Now." Lila didn't argue. She grabbed her coat, sprinted toward the barn through the rising whiteout. Nighthawk followed without being asked, staying close enough that she could feel his warmth at her side like a living shield. Inside the barn, chaos trembled in the air. The old mare paced nervously, ears pinned. Flint circled restlessly, hooves clacking on the wooden floor. Lila moved quickly, securing latches, checking water buckets, scattering extra hay. The storm hammered the roof above, each gust rattling the beams like distant thunder. When she reached Nighthawk's stall, he stepped inside without hesitation, turning only once to glance toward the open doorway, as if expecting Ethan to appear beside him. "Dad's fine," she whispered, brushing snow from his mane. "He's inside." But Nighthawk didn't settle. He paced once, twice, then pressed his head against the stall bars. He snorted sharply, frustrated, alert. "You want him here," she realized. "You want him close." Another gust slammed the barn doors, sending a shiver through the horses. Lila hesitated only long enough to understand that Nighthawk wasn't afraid for himself. He was afraid for Ethan. She sprinted back toward the house. Snow stung her cheeks like needles. When she reached the porch, Ethan was standing at the railing, staring into the white haze, swallowing the yard. "You shouldn't be out here," she said, breathless. "You need to rest." "I can't rest," he said quietly. "Not when everything feels like—" His voice faded. "Like it did that night." Lila didn't ask which night. She'd seen the scars in the silence. She knew the outline of the grief that dragged him awake. A branch snapped somewhere in the storm, loud, sharp, close. Ethan flinched visibly. "Dad," she whispered, placing a hand on his arm, "come to the barn. It's warmer there. And Nighthawk, he wants you." Ethan swallowed hard. The storm howled again, throwing snow across the porch like handfuls of dust. For a long moment he didn't move. Then, slowly, he nodded. Lila offered her shoulder. Together they made their way across the yard, leaning into the wind. Snow piled thick on their coats, their boots disappearing beneath the drifts. Nighthawk saw them through the open barn doors and whinnied, a soft, relieved sound that cut through the storm like a lantern in darkness. Ethan stepped into the barn and let the door shut behind him. The sudden warmth, the quiet, the earthy scent of hay, all of it washed over him like a balm. His breath steadied. Nighthawk pushed his muzzle against Ethan's chest, nudging gently. Ethan rested a hand against the gelding's cheek, fingers sinking into the thick winter coat. "I'm here," Ethan whispered, voice trembling. "I'm here." The storm raged outside, beating against the barn with a fury that belonged to some older, colder world. But inside, the space felt sacred, dim amber light, the soft rustle of horses settling, the steady heartbeat of something larger than fear. Lila sat on a hay bale nearby, watching her father lean into Nighthawk's presence, the way Jonah had, the way Amy had, the way she had. For a moment, grief, loneliness, love, and relief wove together so tightly that she could no longer tell them apart. "You saved him twice today," she whispered to Nighthawk. The gelding blinked, slow and steady. The wind howled, the rafters creaked. But for the first time in years, Ethan closed his eyes and didn't look afraid. The white night of Montana raged on, but inside the barn the world finally felt warm. The storm eased by sunrise, leaving behind a valley transformed. The snow was smooth and unbroken, stretched across the land like a clean sheet waiting to be written on. Icicles hung from the barn roof, catching the early light and scattering it in tiny rainbows. The world had been stripped quiet, washed, humbled, softened. Inside the barn, the horses stirred restlessly, but Nighthawk stood perfectly still beside Ethan, as if he had held vigil through the night. Ethan's hand rested on the gelding's shoulder, his breath moving in slow, measured rhythm. Lila approached quietly, not wanting to break the fragile peace in the air. "You stayed out here all night?" she asked. Ethan nodded without opening his eyes. "Didn't feel right to leave him." "He wouldn't have minded," she said gently. "That's not the point," he murmured. She didn't press. Some things were meant to be held in silence. Some healing required a kind of stillness no words could carry. Lila fetched coffee from the house, steam curling from the mugs as she handed one to her father. Ethan took it with a shaky breath of gratitude. Nighthawk lifted his head, nudging Ethan's shoulder with a tenderness that felt deliberate. "That thing he did yesterday," Ethan said after a moment, "in the woods, I still don't understand it." Lila sat beside him on a hay bale. "It wasn't luck." "No," Ethan said, "it wasn't." His eyes were softer today, clearer, stripped of the usual guarded tension, as if the storm had shaken loose something he'd been gripping for years. A soft knock echoed from the barn door. Rachel stepped inside with Jonah's hand wrapped tightly in hers. The boy wore the same puffy blue jacket from earlier in the week, though now it looked more like armor than insulation, something he relied on to face the world. "I came to check on you," Rachel said to Ethan. "I heard about the storm. Jonah insisted we come early." Jonah tugged free from his mother's hold and walked straight to Nighthawk. No hesitation, no searching glance at Lila or Ethan. He moved with the certainty of someone approaching a familiar sanctuary. Nighthawk lowered his head, letting the boy press his cheek against the warm fur of his neck. Jonah's fingers curled gently into the horse's mane, and his shoulders dropped with a long exhale. "See?" Rachel whispered, voice cracking. "He slept through the whole night. First time in months. He said, 'Hawk before breakfast.'" Ethan blinked, stunned. "He talked again?" Rachel nodded, tears building. "Just the one word, but I've learned to measure miracles in small pieces." Lila felt a warmth spread beneath her ribs. Jonah's presence had filled the barn with something quiet and luminous. The boy held on to Nighthawk like someone who had found a place his heart could finally rest. A few moments later, Dr. May arrived, brushing snow from her coat. Her eyes went straight to Ethan's bandaged leg. "Heard you had a rough day," she said. Ethan grunted. could have been worse. May's gaze softened. "He found you, didn't he?" Ethan nodded. "I told you," she said with a faint smile. "He finds the ones who need him." She knelt beside Jonah and Nighthawk, watching the boy lean into the gelding with a quiet devotion. "You see it now, don't you?" she whispered to Ethan. "See what?" "That this horse isn't broken. He's attuned." Ethan let the words settle, his jaw tightening in that familiar way he had whenever emotion brushed too close. But he didn't look away. He watched Jonah, watched the calm settle over him like soft snowfall. Then he watched Nighthawk, who stood like a lighthouse in a stormless morning. Something shifted in Ethan's face, reluctant acceptance turning into something gentler. Later that day, word spread through the small valley. Amy stopped by with warm biscuits and a shy smile that didn't quite hide the quiet gratitude in her eyes. She didn't approach Nighthawk the way Jonah did, but she sat in the barn for a long time, watching him with a calmness she hadn't known in years. By evening, the sun stretched across the snow like honey poured over a page. People came and went, neighbors checking in after the storm, offering salt for the driveway, asking about Ethan's leg, sharing updates about downed branches and frozen pipes. But every person entered the barn the same way, slowly, hushed, as though stepping into a place where something sacred had happened. As dusk settled, Ethan managed to walk without leaning on the wall. Lila stayed beside him, but she didn't need to steady him. Nighthawk stood at the center of the barn aisle, head lowered, eyes soft. Ethan approached him with a kind of reverence Lila had never seen from her father toward anyone or anything. "You kept me alive yesterday," Ethan said quietly. "More than I want to admit." Nighthawk breathed out, ears flicking gently. "And today," Ethan added, glancing at Jonah, who sat cross-legged in the hay with the horse's tail draped across his lap, "you kept this boy steady." He placed a hand on the gelding's cheek, thumb brushing a small patch of white hair near the eye that was still clouded. "You're a damn miracle," Ethan whispered, voice raw. Nighthawk blinked slowly, leaning into his touch. Lila felt her eyes sting. Her father rarely spoke with such vulnerability, not since the night they lost her mother, not since the fire scars carved themselves into his memory. When Jonah's mother called him to leave, the boy hesitated, then whispered into Nighthawk's mane, "Hawk," before letting go. Rachel hugged Lila tightly, tears bright in her eyes. "Thank you," she whispered, "for giving him a place to breathe again." When the barn finally emptied, the light outside had faded to a soft lavender, and the first stars glimmered above the tree line. Lila leaned against the stall door, watching her father linger near Nighthawk, as though unwilling to break the spell. "His being here changes everything," Ethan said. Lila nodded. "I know." But what she didn't say, what she barely dared to think, was that the change wasn't just for Jonah or Amy or Ethan. It was for her too. For the part of her that had gone numb after losing her mother. For the quiet ache she had carried alone. Everything really was changing. And Nighthawk, the horse no one wanted, was somehow at the heart of it all. Spring arrived in Montana the way forgiveness often arrives, quietly, without ceremony, softening edges no one realized had grown sharp. Snow receded from the valley in thin, hesitant lines, revealing patches of brown grass beneath. The cottonwoods stretched tender new buds toward the sky. And for the first time in years, the Mercer Ranch felt like a place waking up rather than merely holding on. Word of Nighthawk spread slowly at first, passed from neighbor to neighbor, from families who'd visited the barn during the storm, from Jonah's mother, whose whispered thank yous seemed to follow Lila everywhere she went. But soon people from the next valley over began stopping by, searching for something they couldn't quite name. Not a miracle, just a moment of quiet, a breath of steadiness, something that felt like hope. Lila never advertised anything. Ethan didn't place a sign at the road or mention it to the feed store. Yet small groups continued to arrive, men who worked long shifts at the mill, women caring for aging parents, teenagers, carrying burdens too heavy for their age. They came with silence in their eyes and left with something loosened in their chests. Nighthawk greeted each person the same way, steady, patient, offering himself without question or expectation. He didn't perform tricks. He didn't charm through mischief or beauty. He simply was, a living, breathing stillness that let others finally rest. One mild afternoon, Lila walked out to the pasture to check the fence line. The sun was warm enough that she didn't bother with gloves. Nighthawk followed behind her at a gentle distance, steps slow and measured. Ethan trailed a bit farther back, leaning on a walking stick he didn't like to admit he needed. "You doing okay?" Lila asked, glancing toward him. Ethan nodded. "Legs healing." He paused. "Mine's healing too, I think." Nighthawk snorted softly, as if agreeing. Ethan chuckled. "That horse has opinions." "He always did," Lila said. They reached the ridge overlooking the valley. From there, the land spread out like a painting. Hills brushed with the leftover gold of winter grass, fields broken in soft curves, the barn glowing red under the afternoon light. For a moment, none of them spoke, not because they didn't have words, because the words felt too small. When they headed back, they saw a familiar figure walking up the dirt road. Amy Caldwell, no longer wrapped tight in the heaviness she used to carry. She waved, breathless, cheeks flushed. "Sorry to barge in," Amy said. "I was baking and thought I'd bring you some bread." Lila smiled warmly. "You never have to apologize." Amy's eyes drifted to Nighthawk, who stepped toward her slowly. She placed a hand against his neck, and he leaned in, not heavily, just enough to greet her with the same quiet acceptance he seemed to carry for everyone. "He's looking stronger," Amy murmured, "and happier." "He is," Lila said. "We all are." Amy nodded, eyes glimmering. "This ranch feels different now, warmer, as if someone lit a lantern at the center of it." Her words caught Ethan off guard. He cleared his throat, looking away toward the open fields. "Sometimes it takes the right horse," he said, voice soft. Amy laughed lightly. "Or the right moment." Jonah and Rachel arrived not long after, Jonah running ahead with a joy that made Rachel shake her head in disbelief. The boy skidded to a halt beside Nighthawk, hands bearing into the horse's mane as if it were the most natural thing in the world. "Hawk," he whispered, the word clear and strong. Rachel covered her mouth to hold back a sob. Ethan rested a hand on her shoulder without looking directly at her. Comfort offered quietly, respectfully. Later, Lila led Nighthawk to the lower pasture, letting him wander freely. He moved with the subtle stiffness of age in his injured shoulder, but he seemed content, ears flicking to every voice, every bird call, every subtle shift in the land. Lila leaned on the fence and watched the last light sink behind the ridge, then joined her, lowering himself carefully onto the rail. "I owe you an apology," he said after a long silence. "For what?" "For not seeing what you saw. I didn't believe in him, not the way you did. I was blind." "You weren't blind," she said softly. "You were hurting." Ethan swallowed, gaze fixed on the horse grazing in the fading light. "Your mother always said beauty wasn't the shine on something. It was whether it could hold your weight when you leaned on it." Lila smiled faintly. "Nighthawk holds all of us." "And more," Ethan murmured. The air cooled with evening. A thin layer of pink softened the sky. Nighthawk lifted his head, ears pointed toward them as if listening to a conversation carried only by the wind. "He saved my life," Ethan said. "Not just in the woods. I mean, really saved it." Lila slipped her hand through his arm. I know. As the last sliver of sunlight dipped below the horizon, Nighthawk walked toward the fence, stopping just in front of them. His clouded eye caught the light, turning it into a soft pearl blue shimmer. Lila reached out and rested her hand against his cheek. Ethan did the same. The horse leaned into both of them, standing still as a stone. "He was never ugly," Lila whispered. "People just didn't know how to see him." Nighthawk blinked slowly, breath warm in the cooling air. The valley held its breath, the wind softened, and for one suspended moment, everything felt exactly as it should. The horse no one wanted. The creature dismissed, ignored, overlooked, had become the quiet heart of a place that desperately needed healing. And standing there in the growing dusk, Lila knew with unwavering certainty. This was beauty, not what the world demanded, but what the soul recognized. If this story touched something in you, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Share a comment below, just a simple line about what part stayed with you the most. And if you'd like to join me for more quiet, heartfelt stories like this, make sure to like the video and subscribe. There are many more journeys waiting for us, and I'd be honored to have you with me for the next one.